Hello everyone. Before we get into the video, there has to be a slight correction made. At the end of Pompey the Great Part 1, I said that the tribune of 66 was Gaius Manlius. However, his name is actually Gaius Manilius. Gaius Manilius will be put on trial twice, and I will be talking about him in this video. So when you hear his name, he's the tribune of 66. Thank you. When the Senate decreed that Pompey be given the Mithridatic command, it was with the intention that Pompey was going to finish the war. In the 5 years of campaigning, Lucullus had pursued Mithridates through Bithynia and Pontus and into Armenia, where Mithridates took refuge with his son-in-law Tigranes the Great. But because of his waning political support and his mutinous legions refusing to obey his command, Lucullus was forced to stop the pursuit. By 68, Mithridates had forced his way back into Pontus and defeated the occupying Roman forces there. Pompey had one intention when dealing with Mithridates, that the Poison King had to die. He had been allowed to live in the previous 2 wars, and Pompey believed that no matter how many victories he gained, that if war was truly to come to an end, he would have to take the life of Mithridates. Mithridates had been in contact with Phraates III of Parthia, in the hopes that he can get Parthia to fight against the Romans. But either Pompey or Lucullus had managed to convince Parthia to stay neutral. This caused Mithridates to cut his losses and to try to make peace with Rome by sending emissaries to Pompey. But Pompey could not allow the war to be won so easily, because it would prove that Lucullus had won the war, and it would be seen as him just trying to claim another man's glory, which is what his political enemies were saying. So Pompey gave Mithridates an offer he had to refuse: unconditional surrender and to hand over all deserters. Mithridates refused. The first thing Pompey did was undo everything that Lucullus had done, including his edicts and his provisions for his supporters. When Pompey had to take control over Lucullus's troops in Galatia, he set out from Cilicia to Galatia, where he met up with a delegation sent from Rome to organize Lucullus's conquest. Pompey refused to let him do so. He wanted to be the one to organize Roman rule in the east. Any reconciliation that might have been achieved between Lucullus and Pompey was now over. Lucullus would work alongside Cato the Younger in the future to successfully block Pompey's eastern arrangements in 61/60. Their meeting was not pleasant. Pompey accused Lucullus of being Xerxes in a toga, while Lucullus retorted, calling Pompey a vulture that feasted on other creatures' kills and could not kill a prey of his own, and that all he did was lust after power. Pompey now set out to face Mithridates. Mithridates hoped to lure Pompey into Pontus, where he would suffer from a lack of supplies, but Mithridates underestimated Pompey's logistical skills. After several skirmishes, Pompey managed to score a major victory against Mithridates. Mithridates retreated into Armenia, where he found that the king Tigranes had betrayed him. He had placed a bounty of 100 talents for the king's head. King Tigranes was facing a rebellion and believed Mithridates to be in on it. Was he in on it? Probably not, but who knows. So instead, the Poison King fled north to Colchis and the Bosporus. Pompey tried to catch him before he fled by invading Armenia, but failed. The political situation in Armenia was unstable. The son of King Tigranes convinced his father-in-law, the Parthian king Phraates, to move against his father. Pompey was only too excited to exploit the situation. He played both sides. He welcomed the king's son with open arms and allowed him to be his guide as he marched on Armenia's capital, Artajat. King Tigranes the Great, however, was smart, and he wasn't about to give up his land to the Parthians. He surrendered before Pompey at the gates of the capital, in an elaborately staged meeting where the king laid his diadem at the feet of Pompey Magnus. Pompey was flattered. He placed the crown back on the king's head and restored him to his kingdom. But what exactly were the boundaries of the kingdom going to be? Pompey's declaration was that King Tigranes was to keep his ancestral home of Armenia. However, he was to lose Syria, part of Cappadocia and Cilicia, and Sophene, and he was to pay an indemnity of 6,000 talents. His son was angry that he wasn't getting his father's kingdom, but Pompey allowed him to have Sophene. But this was odd because at Sophene it held the royal treasuries of Armenia, and the son of Tigranes had colluded with Parthia against his father, which made him a threat to Pompey. So it is possible that it was only a temporary position. The son would soon be arrested, and the treasury back in the hands of King Tigranes, who gave Pompey a generous donation, which in turn Pompey made him a friend and an ally to Rome. Pompey then granted Tigranes Sophene. His son would be taken back to Rome, where he would be displayed during Pompey's triumph. King Phraates of Parthia tried to intervene on his son-in-law's behalf, but failed. When he asked Pompey about the present position of the Euphrates frontier, Pompey told him that he would abide by whatever frontier seemed just to him. By the end of 66 BC, Armenia had been reduced to depend on Rome, as well as Tigranes had agreed to receive a Roman garrison, and Mithridates had been driven out of Asia Minor. Pompey now turned his attention to dealing with Mithridates. Mithridates by the end of 66 was heading towards Colchis. Now Colchis had defected to Roman rule during the end of Lucullus' campaign. Mithridates had only a few troops beyond his own bodyguard, but he had 6,000 talents, which is a good chunk of change. Now we don't know if the governor Malphanes, the man who defected to Rome, was still alive or not by this point. So this act from Mithridates was more of an act of desperation than any hope of assistance. He eventually reached Dioscorius, located at the northern edge of the territory, where he will winter there, and in 65 he will continue to the Cimmerian Bosporus, where he will expel his treacherous son Machares and establish himself there. Pompey, meanwhile, was in Pontus completing its reduction, as well as sending his trusted lieutenant Afranius to take Gordiane from the Parthians, who took it from the Armenians. Gordiane was given back to Armenia. By 64, Pompey was at Amisos, where he was visited by no fewer than 12 kings, where he was deciding what was to be done with the kingdom of Mithridates. Mithridates, in the meantime, was in Bosporus, planning his last big adventure, the invasion of Italy. He was going to travel by land, along the Danube, making allies with the various Celtic peoples of Central Europe, and invade Italy, much like Hannibal had done, but this plan would never come to be. He would commit suicide by the end of 64. Pompey had gone to Syria to see the liquidation of the Seleucid kingdom. However, King Antiochus XIII had been recognized as king by Lucullus, but Pompey saw Antiochus's right extinguished once he was captured by Tigranes. In Pompey's eyes, Syria already belonged to Rome, and so he insisted on annexation once he was in Antioch. When Parthia attacked Gordiane, Pompey was ready to start a full-scale invasion of Parthia, but he was hesitant because of the attacks he would receive back in Rome. Instead, he attacked Gordiane while on his way to Syria and brokered a peace between Armenia and Parthia. In 63, both Judea, which was torn by the Hasmonean civil war, and Nabatea, whose king Aretas was making incursions into now Roman territory, both presented a problem. Pompey had pursued Aristobulus, who was king of Judea, because he had ignored Pompey's orders to give up his garrisons. Pompey had besieged Aristobulus at Jerusalem, where he arrested the Jewish king. Jerusalem was taken in a slaughter and the temple was desecrated, but he did not plunder his treasures. Hyrcanus, a man who was seeking Pompey's support for the Jewish throne, was put into power as a high priest instead of a king. The news of Mithridates' death reached Pompey, who was on the outskirts of Nabatean Petra, where he left the operation to Scaurus to deal with the Nabateans. This is because the Lex Manilia had expired with the death of Mithridates, and so Pompey's command in the east could now be questioned. He was probably annoyed at the fact that he could not use Mithridates in his triumph. Mithridates was buried in Sinope by his son Pharnaces, and Pompey granted him the kingdom of Bosporus. In 62, Pompey distributed lavish rewards to his troops. On his way back home, Pompey was visiting various Greek cities. He first visited the city of Mytilene, the home to his personal historian Theophanes, which was granted its freedom as a compliment to his historian. He then visited Rhodes, where he spoke with the sophist Posidonius, as well as made a donation of 50 talents to the city of Athens. Now let us discuss in greater detail Pompey's organization of the East. The kingdom of Pontus was annexed and merged with Bithynia to create the single province of Bithynia et Pontus, and divided into 11 communities, each with an urban center. Each area required a different range of organization. For instance, Zela was expanded and Pompey settled more people within the walls to strengthen the administrative center. Eupatoria, a city that was under construction started by Mithridates, was renamed to Magnopolis and completed by Pompey. Cabira was also expanded and renamed Diospolis. The village of Phasamon was declared a city and renamed Neapolis. Nicopolis was a genuine city founded after the expulsion of Mithridates. These various changes will last over the centuries. Cassius Dio notes during the 2nd century AD that Pompey's arrangements were still in effect to his own day. Any regions that were too underdeveloped were given to the local rulers as a reward for serving Pompey. The tetrarchs of Galatia were confirmed in their kingdoms, and one in particular, Diotarus, was richly rewarded, receiving parts of Pontus and Armenia Minor. In Colchis, Aristarchus was established, and in Cappadocia, Ariobarzanes had been restored to the throne and given parts of Cilicia. Commagene was established as a buffer for Syria and Cilicia under its king Antiochus. The further south you go, the more incomplete you'll find Pompey's organization, and this is because of a lack of time. However, eventually his efforts will be completed by Gabinius during his governorship of Syria. A few things that are worthy of note is that Pompey rebuilt Gadara, and various cities in Coel Syria were taken from the Judean region and merged with the province of Syria. Pompey had now riddled the coast of Asia Minor with provinces and protected them further with a series of client kingdoms. such as Bosporus, Colchis, Armenia Minor, Paphlagonia, Galatia, Cappadocia, Commagene, the Syrian and Cilician princedoms, as well as Armenia and Sophene. These client kingdoms would have to pay tribute to Rome, which brought in enormous wealth. Pliny the Elder writes, the greatest glory in that was, as he himself said on condition when he was discussing his affairs, that he had received Asia the lowest of the provinces, and had rendered it the center of his country. And Pompey could say that. There is an issue, however, because of the lack of time Pompey had in organizing the south, particularly Syria and Judea. He left them open to incursions, internal strife, and the fear of Parthian invasion. Syria and Judea did not have the series of buffer client kingdoms to its south and southeast, and this made them vulnerable. The greatest thing to come from Pompey's eastern arrangements was the vast clientele. This was on a scale unheard of. Not only was he now the richest man in Rome from the wealth brought in, and not only did individuals and cities recognize Pompey as their patron, but so did entire provinces and kingdoms as well. By the time of the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey broke out, Pompey could rely on the entire East, in money and in manpower and ships, to heed his call. Back in Rome, anti-Pompeians had begun to attack Pompey's supporters during his years away in the East. Gaius Manilius, as soon as his tribunate expired, was put on trial for repetundi, which is the illegal acquisition of money or property as a Roman authority overseas. Manilius really wanted Cicero to defend him, but Cicero refused. Not that Cicero could have anyway, since he was a praetor of his trial, but Manilius wanted Cicero's influence. Manilius requested a 10-day delay, which was customary, but Cicero refused. However, Manilius had popular support, and Cicero would be forced to defend Manilius. In 65, he was prosecuted again, this time under the charge majestas, which was used as an abbreviation for the crime, the diminution of the majesty of the Roman people. But because this phrase was so vague, it was used for crimes such as treason, revolt, or failure of public duty. During the 90s onwards, it really became a charge against treason. Now, at the time of the trial, Manilius attacked the prosecutor, Gnaeus Minucius, but was beaten back by Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus. Domitius was an adversary to Manilius, which may have been part of the reason Cicero did not want to defend him. The Aenobarbi was a very powerful family, and also a legendary one, and winning over Domitius' support would help him immensely. Cicero once said that Domitius was, since the cradle, destined for the consulship due to how wealthy and influential his family was, and he will become consul in 54. Domitius will support Cicero in his run for the consulship in 63, and Cicero will even say that it was Domitius' support above everyone else that his success relied upon. The proceedings were broken up and the trial was delayed. However, when the trial occurred again, Manilius never showed up and was condemned in absence. This victory gave the opposition against Pompey confidence to attack another supporter of his, Gaius Cornelius. Now, who do we see among the witnesses? The most powerful Sullan oligarchs. The claim against Cornelius was that he ignored the veto of his fellow tribune, Servilius Galabulus, which he did do, which caused riots, but because the Sullan law, majestas, was so ambiguous, both sides tried to manipulate that ambiguity. Now, Cornelius was in deep water because there were witnesses, prominent witnesses. However, the prosecution witnesses could not cite particulars in the law to accuse Cornelius. Cicero then seized upon this opportunity. Cornelius's actions did not coincide with anything written out as an offense in the law. The accusers, however, called for a liberal interpretation of the law, that the spirit of it had been violated. This ambiguity was used as an advantage for Cicero. He could not deny the facts, but he could deny its implications. His response was that it could hardly have been treason to read aloud from a piece of paper, that he was simply re-examining it, and as for ignoring the tribune's veto, he complied with it by canceling the meeting right after. Now Cicero defended Cornelius and exploited his connection with Pompey, and this would get him acquitted. This won for Cornelius the support of the Equites, the Tribune Aerari, and a number of senators who were not connected with, as Asconius puts it, the Principes. Cicero's victory would guarantee Pompey's support for his run for the consulship in 63. Having Domitius Aenobarbus and now Pompey's support, it really could not have gone any better for Cicero. However, this victory would cost Cicero in view of the Optimates, who were displeased with him. Now during this time, Crassus will attempt to rival power to that of Pompey, but many of his attempts will fail. I talk more about this in my Catalan video. However, I will go over briefly his attempts. Crassus will get Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, an anti-Pompeian, elected to the command in Spain, but he will die there shortly after. Crassus, as censor in 65, will attempt to enfranchise further those north of the Po River in the Transpadane region of Gaul, a great source of manpower where Pompey had clientele. This was an attempt for Crassus to gain clientele himself, but this backfired. The Senate was not ready for an influx of new citizens. Next, Crassus, with the help of Caesar, who held the aedileship, tried to get the kingdom of Egypt annexed, which would have been a great source of clientele, and overall full of great strategic opportunities like controlling the corn supply. However, Catullus and Cicero will argue against Crassus, and the attempt will fail. In 64, Cicero was supported by both Pompeians and the Optimates. Many were afraid that Pompey would return home from the east and become another Sulla. The other candidates, such as Catiline and Gaius Antonius, were more or less unreliable, especially Catiline, who was notorious under Sulla, and whose conduct as governor of Africa angered Metellus Pius, the most powerful man of that region. If Pompey, although showing no signs of wanting to seize power, returned from the east and did not disband his legions, it would be Cicero who would act as a moderating influence on Pompey. Cicero would never support Pompey seizing power. When Cicero won the consulship, he was in a pickle. If he supported Pompey's interest, he would lose support of the Optimates, and if he helped the Optimates, he would lose support of Pompey. So Cicero will walk that tightrope between the two his entire consulship. It is possible, though, that if Cicero had not squashed the Catiline conspiracy, Pompey probably would have exploited the issue once he landed in Italy. Now, it is time to introduce the man of the hour, Marcus Porcius Cato Udicensis, also known as Cato the Younger. This man bursted himself onto the scene in his early 30s, an age when men, even of the most noble stock, would have been terrified to speak in the Senate House. His prominence came when he single-handedly convinced the Senate to side with Cicero against Catiline in 63. He was Caesar's arch-nemesis and fought against the first Triumvirate his entire career. He was a force of personality and won the respect of his contemporaries. All areas of Roman government felt his presence, from judiciary and legislative activity to administration and foreign policy. He was a resolute Stoic and the very symbol of the Roman Republic. Cicero called him a man who was worth 100,000 men. If you would like to know more about Cato the Younger, I have an entire series on his life. A link will be in the description below. In 62, Caesar had won the praetorship, and Metellus Nepos had won the tribunate. Nepos proposed two bills, one that Pompey should be recalled from the east to deal with Catiline, which by this time was coming to a close, and to allow Pompey to stand in absentia for the consulship of 61. It is hard to say if Nepos was working with Pompey. What most likely is the case is that he was trying to gratify Pompey, his former commander. Now Nepos' colleague was none other than Cato, who claimed that he was running for the tribunate to stop any undesirable actions from Nepos. When Nepos convened the Senate to discuss his bills, Cato gave reasonable and moderate advice, even praising his family name, which was much different than Cato's usual style, which was warlike according to Plutarch. I mean, by this point, Cato had already tried to have Caesar executed during the Catiline conspiracy because Cato had already believed Caesar to be a threat to the Roman Republic, which, strictly speaking, Caesar was acting no different than your average aristocrat. But Nepos saw this as a weakness and attacked Cato, but Cato flew off the handle, telling Nepos that Pompey would never enter Rome at the head of an army while Cato lived. Nepos, along with Caesar who supported the bills, tried to bypass the Senate and pass the bills through the People's Assembly. However, Cato and his allies caught wind of this and vetoed Nepos' attempt. Violence broke out to the extent that the Senate may have passed a Senatus Consultum Ultimum to deal with it. And Caesar, who was not prepared for the violence, walked away, and Nepos and Cato's supporters fought each other. Nepos eventually fled to Pompey, and Pompey was probably unaware as to what was going on. Pompey never took up Nepos' cause. He expected the respect and honor due to him upon his return, and had practical demands, the ratification of his eastern command, and land for his troops. However, Pompey was coming to the realization that this might not be easy. When he asked the Senate to delay the consular elections in 62 for 61, so that he could canvass his support for his candidate Marcus Pupius Piso in person, the Senate rejected him. The driving spirit behind this rejection was Cato, who vehemently opposed it, and managed to convince the Senate against it. Near the end of 62, probably in December, Pompey finally returned to Italy, landing in Brundisium. Even though Pompey was in a great position to become another Sulla, he immediately disbanded his troops. He did this because he wanted to show the Senate that he truly did not intend to seize power. Now there were some who were disappointed, who wanted Pompey to become another Sulla, so that they can benefit from the proscriptions. Pompey's first action was to divorce his wife Mucia and request the niece of Cato, the daughter of the consul Decimus Silanus, and Cato's sister Servilia, and he also requested the sister of Servilia to be married off to his eldest son. This was Pompey's way of neutralizing Cato, or perhaps gaining his support. However, it was not the best decision to divorce his wife before securing another, because Cato will scornfully deny Pompey and will say that he did not want his political freedom to be hemmed in by his relationship to Pompey. Divorcing Mucia risked offending the Metelli, which was Metellus Celer and Metellus Nepos, and Celer was going to run for the consulship of 60. Having Cato reject him not only confirmed that there would be opposition towards Pompey, but left him looking like a fool. Now, during this time, Cicero was upset with Pompey because Pompey did not adequately praise Cicero's achievements as consul. While praising Pompey, he equated his achievements to that of Pompey as being equally great, if not greater. Now, this was an over-exaggeration on Cicero's part, and this rubbed Pompey the wrong way. Next, we have the infamous Bona Dea scandal. The rites of the Bona Dea were taking place in the house of Julius Caesar, who was at this time the Pontifex Maximus. The rites of Bona Dea excluded all men from participating. In fact, no man could even witness the ceremony. However, a patrician by the name of Clodius Pulcher will dress up like a woman and sneak into the ceremony only to be caught and chased around the house being tossed out. This caused a huge scandal throughout Rome, and it was deemed sacrilegious. Clodius Pulcher will be brought to trial because of it. Now let me introduce him. He served abroad with his brother-in-law, Lucullus, during the 60s, only to cause mutiny throughout the ranks. He will force Cicero into exile for the execution of the Catiline conspirators, and he will harass Pompey and roam around with a gang in Rome, causing violence. He was an unsavory character, to say the least. But for now, let's continue. Now, Pompey didn't really know all the details, nor did he really care. However, he will be forced to. I'm going to read to you from Cicero, who documents this event. He writes, "Then an irresponsible tribune, Fufius, egged on by Consul Piso, a friend of Claudius, called Pompey out to address the assembly. Fufius asked him whether he thought it right for a jury to be selected by a praetor to serve under the same praetor's presidency, that being the procedure determined by the Senate in the Clodius sacrilege case. Pompey then replied, very much like an aristocrat, that in all matters he held, and had always held, the Senate's authority in the highest respect, at considerable length too. Subsequently, Consul Messala asked Pompey in the Senate for his views about the sacrilege and the promulgated bill. He then made a speech commending in general terms all decrees of that body, and remarked to me as he sat down beside me that he hoped he had now replied sufficiently to a questioning on these matters. When Crassus saw that Pompey had netted some credit from the general impression that he approved of my consulship, he got to his feet and held forth on the subject in most encomiastic terms, going so far as to say that it was me he owed his status as a senator and a citizen, his freedom, and his very life. In short, he worked up the whole theme which I am in the habit of embroidering in my speeches one way and another, all about fire, sword, etc. I was sitting next to Pompey, and I can see he was put out, whether at Crassus gaining credit which might have been his, or to realize that my achievements are of sufficient consequence to make the Senate so willing to hear them praised. Praised, too, by a man who had all the less reason to offer me such incense, in that everything I have written glorifies Pompey at his expense. Crassus was trying to drive a wedge here between Cicero and Pompey, by elaborately praising Cicero, and Cicero here notes Pompey's annoyance, but he is unsure whether it was because of Crassus or from the praise Cicero receives for his deeds. It was probably both. Now, during the trial, Clodius had little support aside from the consul Piso and the tribune Fufius Calenus, and the consul of 76 Gaius Curio. Clodius organized public meetings in which he attacked Messala, Lucullus, and Hortensius, but to no avail. The Senate will vote for the praetor to decide the jury, and this will defeat Fufius' attempts. However, Hortensius will flip and call for a public jury. Perhaps because Claudius was clearly guilty, he felt that it wouldn't make a difference. Cicero knew that it would be a problem. Claudius was defended by Curio, and large sums of money were spent on bribing the jury. He was acquitted by 31 votes to 25. Cicero's testimony during the trial destroyed Claudius's alibi, which Claudius wouldn't forget. Cicero will be forced into exile because of this later on. The people loved Cicero, and despite the outcome of the trial, Cicero was extremely happy at his performance. He continued to attack Claudius and his allies, preventing Piso from attaining the province of Syria, and in his own eyes, shattered Claudius. The young Curio and his friends will try to provoke Pompey by calling him Gnaeus Cicero, which was a great insult, by the way, but Pompey will dig in his heels and back Cicero. Despite Pompey's recent failures, he will throw in his backing to get his trusted legate Lucius Afranius elected consul, and Metellus Celer, but Metellus Celer could not really be relied upon since Pompey had divorced Mucia, a member of the Metelli. Afranius was where his real support lied. However, Afranius did not come from a prestigious family, and thus he was not well respected by the Senate. In fact, he was actually a bad politician, and Pompey had to dish out an enormous amount of bribes just to get him elected. Cato and his brother-in-law Domitius Enobarbus will attempt to prevent Pompey from dishing out bribes by passing 2 laws that allowed inquiries to be made into the homes of magistrates who were suspected of giving out bribes to voters. This was because there was a rumor circulating that the consul Piso was giving out bribes from his home in order to help out Pompey. The tribune Aufidius Lurco, who received a special dispensation, brought an ambitus bill before the people after the announcement of the elections. However, Cato and his allies failed as Afranius along with Celer will be elected consuls. Pompey was now going to receive his 3rd triumph on his 45th birthday. The triumph took 2 days on the 28th and 29th of September, and Pompey dedicated his spoils to the goddess Minerva. He claimed to have received the surrender of over 12 million people, that he conquered over 1,500 towns and fortresses, that he sunk or captured just under 850 ships, and he boasted about all the nations he had conquered, all the wealth he had brought in, that he had nearly doubled Rome's provincial income, that he had extended the boundaries of the empire to the ends of the earth. All the treasuries that once belonged to Mithridates were displayed throughout the triumph, and was later dedicated on the Capitol. Pompey displayed a huge float, which was described as the trophy of the inhabited world, and he rejected all surnames given to him, that Magnus alone was enough. Many distinguished hostages and prisoners preceded Pompey's chariot, including the young Tigranes and Aristobulus. Pompey, the man of the hour, wore a cloak that he claimed once belonged to Alexander the Great. After the triumph, Pompey allowed the prisoners and hostages to return home at the state's expense, except for the kings, and only Aristobulus was put to death. Now, towards the end of 61, the Publicani had won at the most recent auction a contract to extort everyone in Asia. However, they miscalculated. Asia is the most profitable region of the empire, but they did not take into account the damage that had been done to the province during the Mithridatic Wars. Asia was broke, and this meant that the Publicani would not be able to make the customary enormous profit, and that they would be unable to cover the costs. So what did these respectable businessmen do? Well, they asked the Senate for a rebate. Crassus will support the Equites, and Cicero too, although he did not want to. He thought it best to maintain concord between the Senate and the equestrian order, something that he had strived for and succeeded in during his consulship. The only senator to speak out against the proposal was the consul designate Metellus Celer. Cato would have been another if time allowed him to speak. But the relationship between the Equites and the Senate had already been strained back during the trial of Clodius, when there was a threat of an inquiry into the bribery that took place during that trial. Cicero would lament in January of 60 that the concord had been shattered. Pompey during this whole ordeal seems to not have cared much. Pompey now attempted to get land for his veterans as well as the ratification of his eastern acts. However, Afranius was proving to be a terrible consul, and Metellus Celer was now actively against Pompey. Now let's talk a little about Afranius and discover why he was such a bad consul. Afranius was from Brichenum, and he was a client under Pompey. He served with Pompey militarily, as we have seen, and he had some achievements under his belt. But Afranius had no political experience and was inept. He also had no political independence. Since he was a Pompeian client and was a novus homo, or a new man, he had only Pompey to rely upon. Afranius wanted to run for the consulship of 61, but Pompey told him to wait, obviously so that Afranius could be of use to him. But the fact that Pompey pushed for such an inexperienced man into the consulship shows us how little Pompey actually knew about the political arena. Afranius was never going to get anywhere because he was new and had no skills to maneuver in politics. But he had one thing that Pompey valued: loyalty. The tribune Lucius Flavius introduced an agrarian law which would provide land for the veterans and the urban plebs. But opposition to this bill, along with the ratification of Pompey's acts, came not only from Cato and Celer, but also from Crassus, Metellus Creticus, and Lucullus, who had retired from public affairs and rushed back to denounce Pompey. Now, we could have seen this coming. Lucullus had been robbed of the glory of ending the Mithridatic War, and Crassus too had been robbed of ending the war against Spartacus. And Pompey tried to intervene in Creticus's affairs, as well as taking sole glory for his efforts against the pirates. Pompey divorced Mucia, and Celer was rightly angry about that, and Cato was Cato. He didn't like anyone having too much power, and was the prime mover of this opposition. Cicero tried to sit on the fence by proposing numerous modifications to Flavius's bill, in the attempt to appease both sides. Pompey made things worse for himself when he demanded, through Afranius, that the Senate accept his ratifications without going into details. But Lucullus insisted that they go over in detail each item. This was a political maneuver that could be used similarly to that of the filibuster. They could have dragged out each aspect of his ratifications indefinitely. Pompey, who was fed up and frustrated, eventually let the matter drop. Now we had to remember that for Pompey, this had been really the first time he had faced such staunch opposition. He was used to getting what he wanted, either by demanding from the Senate or through a popularis tribune. Now with the agrarian bill for Pompey's veterans, the tribune Flavius, who lost his patience, attempted to stifle their attempts at obstruction of the bill by ordering Keller to be thrown in jail. But this backfired when a number of senators continued attending the consul in his jail cell. Flavius then reacted by placing the tribune's bench in front of the entrance to the jail, and since his office was sacrosanct, they could not remove him. So the consul Keller ordered the prison wall to be breached. This became embarrassing for Pompey, and he was compelled to tell Flavius to let the consul go. The Optimates under Cato was for the first time successful in their attempts at stopping Pompey, and this made him very uncomfortable, and meant that for the foreseeable future that there would be great difficulty in getting what he wanted. He had hoped Afranius would have been able to push his ratifications through the Senate, but the opposition was too strong, and his shadow over Afranius was obvious. Cato and the Optimates had humbled Pompey, or did they? Pompey was now alienated from the Senate. I must now talk about Cato. Cato's determination to put down Pompey had backed Pompey into a corner. As we have seen from the Senate, they had operated more or less through compromise. It is how they dealt with Rome's most ambitious men. They would allow them to live in their limelight, rather than try and stifle their ambition, especially after Sulla had been in power. But Pompey was not only a threat in Cato's eyes. Crassus and the Equites had also been attacked by Cato at every turn. Cicero will accuse Cato of doing harm, that he spoke in the Senate as if he were living in Plato's Republic instead of Romulus's cesspool. Because of Cato, the political arena had been ripening for the likes of the first Triumvirate to be established. And now Caesar will return from his governorship in Spain, and he too had been in Cato's sights. In fact, he was most likely the first to be marked as an enemy by him. Caesar had finally returned home from his praetorian province of Hispania Ulterior. Everyone knew that Caesar was going to run for the consulship, but he first wanted to celebrate his triumph that had been granted to him by the Senate for his actions in Spain. But he arrived too late to celebrate his triumph in time because in order to run for the consulship, he'd have to forfeit his imperium to enter Rome, which meant he had to forfeit his triumph. Now in the past, commanders would request to stand for the consulship in absentia, but Cato passed a law in 62 when he was tribune that prevented this. But Caesar requested a one-time exemption from the law, but Cato convinced the Senate to reject the request. Caesar now had a choice of waiting another year to run for the consulship or abandon his triumph. Caesar would do the unthinkable at the time and abandon his triumph against expectations and cast his name into the elections. The election itself was sweaty. Cato and his allies put all they had into his son-in-law, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. They pooled all their resources together, even dishing out bribery to make sure Bibulus got elected. Caesar, on the other hand, was supported by both Pompey and Crassus, along with another wealthy individual, a close friend of Pompey, Lucius Lucullus. Caesar no doubt promised Crassus and Pompey that they would get what they wanted. What we are seeing here is the formation of the first triumvirate. The elections took place and the new consuls for 59 were Caesar and Bibulus. But Caesar will convince Pompey and Crassus to pool their resources and to work together. This was a strictly practical arrangement, that as long as they work together, they can get what they wanted. Now this was a short-term objective. Neither Caesar, Crassus, or Pompey believed that this would have been a long-term ordeal, and as time will show, it was only effective while Caesar was in office. But this will come at the cost of great unpopularity and much effort. Now the date of when the first triumvirate was officially formed is unknown. It could have been before the election or after Caesar entered office. Caesar and Pompey will send the Spaniard Lucius Balbus to Cicero, who told Cicero that Caesar promises to take his and Pompey's advice in all matters of the state, as well as try to reconcile both Pompey and Crassus. Now, it is no wonder as to why they would want Cicero to be a part of what would be known as the First Triumvirate. Cicero was one of the most respected men in Rome. He was the best orator in Rome, and his efforts to bring everyone together would be sorely needed if Cato and his allies would maintain opposition. But Cicero will decline the offer.